The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. At 28 years old, he had served as one of the Queen's Guard. For nearly 6 years, standing motionless for hours in the iconic bearskin hat and scarlet uniform that tourists from around the world came to photograph, James had always taken pride in his duty. The Royal Guard wasn't just a ceremonial position. It required intense training, unwavering discipline, and the ability to remain completely still regardless of what happened around you. Rain or shine, through crowds of curious onlookers and flashing cameras, the guards stood like living statues, protecting the royal residence with silent dignity. Today started like any other day. James took his position at the main entrance gate at precisely 6 a.m., relieving the night guard with a crisp salute. The familiar weight of his rifle felt comfortable in his hands, and he settled into the meditative state that had become second nature over the years. His mind went quiet, focusing only on his breathing and the subtle sounds around him. Footsteps on pavement, distant traffic, the occasional call of birds in the palace gardens. The first tourists began arriving around 8:30 a.m., as they always did. James had seen thousands of them over the years, families with excited children pointing at his uniform, teenagers trying to make him smile or laugh, elderly couples posing for photos beside him. He had learned to tune them out completely, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face an emotionless mask. But something felt different about this particular morning. There was an unusual energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that James couldn't quite place. The palace staff seemed more hurried than usual, and he noticed several officials in dark suits entering and leaving the building throughout the early hours. Around 10 a.m., the crowd began to grow larger than normal. James could see from his peripheral vision that people were gathering in greater numbers, some carrying flowers, others holding small signs. Their voices carried a different tone than the usual excited chatter of tourists. There was something somber, respectful in the way they spoke to each other in hushed whispers. A young woman approached the gate, her eyes red from crying. She placed a small bouquet of white roses against the palace fence and stepped back, her hands clasped together. James wanted to look down at her, to acknowledge her gesture somehow, but his training held firm. The guard does not move. The guard does not react. The guard maintains his post no matter what. More people began bringing flowers. Within an hour, a sea of colorful blooms had formed along the fence line. The crowd continued to grow, and James could feel their collective emotion building like a wave. Still, he remained motionless, though questions swirled in his mind. Had happened? Why were people gathering like this? An elderly man in a worn military uniform approached James's position. The man's medals caught the sunlight as he came to attention and offered a perfect salute. His weathered face was filled with respect and something else, grief perhaps. James felt a strong urge to return the salute, to honor this fellow serviceman, but his duty demanded stillness. The morning wore on. The crowd grew to hundreds, then thousands. James had never seen anything like it. The atmosphere was peaceful, but heavy with emotion. People of all ages stood quietly, some praying, others simply paying their respects in silence. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, not laughing or playing as they usually did, but watching with wide, serious eyes. By noon, James's legs were beginning to ache, a familiar sensation after hours of standing perfectly still. The physical discomfort seemed secondary to the emotional weight he felt pressing down on him. Whatever had brought all these people here was clearly significant. Being unable to acknowledge their presence was becoming increasingly difficult. A group of school children, no more than 8 or 9 years old, approached with their teacher. Each child carried a single flower, and they took turns placing them with the growing memorial. One little girl with pigtails looked directly at James as she laid down her daisy. Her innocent eyes seemed to be asking him a question he couldn't answer. The teacher gathered the children in a semicircle near James's post and began to speak softly about duty, service, and sacrifice. James found himself listening despite his training, his heart beginning to race, as he started to piece together what might have happened. The respectful silence of the crowd, the flowers, the way people were looking at the palace with such reverence. It all pointed to something momentous. A news crew arrived and began setting up their equipment. James watched from the corner of his eye as reporters prepared for what appeared to be a significant broadcast. The crowd parted respectfully to allow them space, but no one left. If anything, more people continued to arrive throughout the afternoon. As the hours passed, James felt his emotional armor beginning to crack. The training that had served him so well for 6 years, the ability to disconnect, to become a human statue, was being tested in ways he had never experienced. Every face in the crowd told a story of respect, sadness, and hope. Every flower placed at the fence was a gesture of love and remembrance. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting golden light across the palace grounds. James had been at his post for nearly 10 hours, and his replacement would arrive soon. But for the first time in his career, he found himself dreading the end of his shift. Something important was happening here, something historic. And he was both a witness to it and somehow separate from it. A middle-aged woman approached the fence near his position. She was carrying a photograph. James couldn't see it clearly, but he could tell it was old and precious to her. She pressed it against the fence for a moment, her lips moving in silent prayer, then carefully placed it among the flowers as she turned to leave. She looked directly at James. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second before his training reasserted itself, and he looked straight ahead again. But in that brief moment, he saw something in her expression that shook him to his core: gratitude, recognition, and a shared understanding of duty and sacrifice. The crowd continued to grow as evening approached. James knew that whatever had begun this morning was far from over. His relief would arrive soon, but the weight of this day would stay with him forever. Something had changed, not just in the world outside the palace gates, but inside him as well. The shift change at 6 p.m. brought Corporal David Thompson to relieve James at his post. The two guards executed their practiced routine, a synchronized movement that had been performed thousands of times before. But as Thompson took his position, he whispered something that made James's blood run cold. "The Queen passed away this morning," Thompson said quietly, his words barely audible beneath the ceremonial formality of the changing of the guard. Official announcement came. At 6:30 p.m., the whole country is mourning. James felt his world shift beneath his feet. Queen Elizabeth II, the monarch he had sworn to protect, the woman whose residence he had guarded faithfully for 6 years, was gone. Suddenly everything about this extraordinary day made perfect sense. The flowers, the crowds, the tears, the respectful silence. The nation had been gathering to pay their respects even before the official announcement. As James walked away from his post, his mind reeled with the magnitude of what had happened. The Queen had died while he stood guard, and somehow the people had known. They had come to share their grief, to honor her memory, and to show their support for the royal family during their darkest hour. The palace corridors buzzed with activity as James made his way to the guards' quarters. Staff members moved with purpose, but also with a solemnity he had never witnessed before. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, and many had tears in their eyes. This wasn't just the loss of a monarch, it felt like the loss of a beloved family member. In the guards' changing room, James found his fellow servicemen in various states of shock and sadness. Some sat quietly on benches, staring at their hands. Others embraced, offering comfort to one another. The usual joking and casual conversation that typically filled the space after a shift was replaced by an almost sacred silence. Sergeant Williams, 20-year veteran of the Royal Guard, was the first to speak. "She was the only monarch most of us have ever served," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 70 years on the throne, she was our constant, our North Star. James nodded, understanding exactly what Williams meant. The Queen had been a fixture in all their lives, a symbol of stability and continuity in an ever-changing world. Her image was on their money, her portrait hung in their barracks, and they had all taken their oath of service to her personally. As James changed out of his ceremonial uniform, He thought about all the times he had stood guard while the Queen was inside the palace. He had never spoken to her directly, but he had seen her on several occasions, a small, dignified figure who carried herself with grace and authority even into her 90s. There was something comforting about knowing she was there, that their duty was protecting someone so deserving of their service. The television in the common room was broadcasting continuous coverage of the Queen's death. James watched as reporters described her final days at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, surrounded by family. The official statement was brief but poignant, confirming that she had passed peacefully in the afternoon. Images flashed across the screen showing the crowds that had gathered not just at Buckingham Palace, but at royal residences across the United Kingdom: Windsor Castle, Sandringham, the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. Everywhere the Queen had lived or worked, people had come to pay their respects. James thought about his own family back in Yorkshire. His parents had always spoken of the Queen with deep respect and affection. His mother had a collection of commemorative plates and mugs marking various royal celebrations, and his father, a former soldier himself, had always taught James that serving the crown was one of the highest honors a person could receive. He pulled out his phone and called his mother. She answered on the first ring, and he could immediately hear that she had been crying. "Oh, James," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been thinking about you all day, standing there at the palace. It must be so difficult for you boys right now." "It is, ma'am," James replied, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "We all feel like we've lost someone important to us personally." They talked for several minutes about the Queen's remarkable life and legacy. His mother shared memories of watching the coronation on television as a young girl, of celebrating the silver, golden, and diamond jubilees, of feeling proud to be British because of the example the Queen set for the world. After ending the call, James walked outside into the palace courtyard. The crowd beyond the gates had grown even larger in the short time he had been inside. Thousands of people now filled the mall, the wide ceremonial avenue leading to the palace. They stood quietly, many holding candles that flickered like stars. In the gathering darkness, the sight took James's breath away. He had served at the palace during major events before royal weddings, jubilee celebrations, state visits, but he had never seen anything like this. The spontaneous outpouring of love and respect was overwhelming. People had dropped everything to come here, to be part of this moment in history. A colleague joined him at the window. "Look at them," Corporal Martinez said softly. "They're not here because they have to be. They're here because they need to be." The Queen meant something to them, something real and important. James understood exactly what Martinez meant. In an age of social media and instant communication, when people often felt disconnected from their leaders and institutions, the Queen had remained a constant source of stability and comfort. She had been above politics, above controversy, simply a devoted public servant who had given her entire life to her people. Throughout the evening, more details emerged about the Queen's final days. She had continued working until the very end, meeting with politicians and signing documents. Just days before her death, even at 96, she had maintained her commitment to duty and service, the same values that James and his fellow guards tried to embody every day. The palace chaplain arrived to offer counseling and support to any staff members who needed it. Many of the guards took advantage of this opportunity, finding comfort in sharing their feelings about the loss they all felt so deeply. James found himself thinking about the moment the previous morning when his eyes had briefly met those of the woman at the fence. Had she somehow known? Had there been something in the air, some collective intuition, that had drawn people to the palace even before the official announcement? As the night wore on, the crowd outside continued to grow. People brought blankets and settled in for what appeared to be an all-night vigil. Their quiet voices carried across the courtyard, sharing memories of the Queen, comforting one another, and expressing their gratitude for her lifetime of service. James realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be protocols to follow, ceremonies to prepare for, and the enormous responsibility of helping to guide the nation through this transition. King Charles III would now need their protection and service. The guards would play a crucial role in maintaining the dignity and continuity of the monarchy during this difficult time. But tonight, as he prepared for sleep, James felt honored to have been present during this historic moment. He had stood guard during the Queen's final hours, maintaining the tradition of protection and service that had been his privilege to uphold. Tomorrow would bring new duties and new challenges. But tonight, he simply mourned the loss of the remarkable woman whose life had defined an era. 3 days had passed since the Queen's death, and the world had changed in ways James could never have imagined. Buckingham Palace had become the center of a global outpouring of grief that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. What had begun as hundreds of people leaving flowers had transformed into a massive gathering that stretched for miles in every direction. James returned to his post on Sunday morning, and the sight that greeted him was breathtaking. The sea of flowers along the palace fence had grown so large that it extended deep into Green Park. Millions of bouquets, cards, teddy bears, and personal mementos created a colorful carpet of remembrance that seemed to have no end. The sweet fragrance of roses, lilies, and chrysanthemums filled the air, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The crowd had become more organized over the past few days. Volunteers had emerged naturally from among the mourners, helping elderly visitors find places to sit, distributing water to families with small children, and ensuring that the memorial remained respectful and orderly. James watched from his post as people of all ages and backgrounds worked together with a sense of purpose and unity he had rarely witnessed. A group of Commonwealth citizens had traveled from across the globe to pay their respects. James could hear accents from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and dozens of other countries where the Queen had served as head of state. They shared stories of how the Queen's visits to their nations had touched their lives, how her Christmas messages had brought comfort to their families, how her steady presence had provided stability during uncertain times. One elderly gentleman from Jamaica approached the fence near James's position. He was wearing his best suit despite the warm weather, and his hands shook slightly as he placed a handwritten letter among the flowers. As he stepped back, he looked up at the palace with tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he whispered. "Thank you for everything."
Oh.
The man's words carried such genuine emotion that James felt his own eyes begin to water. This was exactly what made his duty so difficult, maintaining his stoic composure while witnessing such raw, heartfelt expressions of love and loss. A young mother with 2 small children caught James's attention. She had been coming to the palace every day since the Queen's death, bringing fresh flowers and teaching her children about the Queen's life and service. Today, she had brought a children's book about Queen Elizabeth, and she sat on a nearby bench reading it aloud to her children and several other young ones who had gathered around. The Queen loved animals, the mother read, especially her corgis and her horses. She loved her family, and she loved her people all around the world. Even when she was very old, she continued to work hard every day to help others. The children listened with wide eyes, asking innocent questions about where the Queen lived and whether she was happy in heaven now. Their pure, simple understanding of loss and love reminded James of his own childhood, when the world had seemed more black and white. When good people lived forever and fairness always prevailed, by midday the crowd had grown so large that police barriers had been set up to manage the flow of people. The queue to leave flowers and pay respects stretched for over 5 miles, with people waiting patiently for hours just to have a moment at the fence. James marveled at their patience and dedication, families with grandparents and babies, teenagers who had taken time off from school, business people still in their work clothes who had come during their lunch breaks. A group of military veterans had formed an informal honor guard among the civilians. They stood at attention throughout the day, their service medals gleaming in the sunlight, offering salutes to passing members of the royal family and maintaining their own vigil alongside. The general public, James felt a special connection to these men and women who understood the meaning of duty and sacrifice. The international media presence had grown exponentially as well. News crews from every major network around the world had set up their equipment, broadcasting live coverage of the unprecedented public response to the Queen's death. James could see reporters speaking into cameras in dozens of different languages, trying to capture the magnitude of what was happening for audiences across the globe. One American reporter standing near James's post was interviewing visitors about what the Queen had meant to them. An elderly woman from Wales spoke about meeting the Queen during a royal visit to her town in 1977. She was so small, the woman recalled, but when she looked at you, it felt like she really saw you. She asked me about my garden, and I told her about my prize-winning roses. She listened as if nothing else in the world mattered at that moment. That's the kind of person she was. She made everyone feel important. A teenager from Scotland shared how the Queen's annual Christmas message had become a tradition in her family. "We always watched it together on Christmas Day," she said. "My gran would insist on complete silence while the Queen was speaking. She said it was like having a wise grandmother talking to the whole family." These stories reminded James of why he had joined the Royal Guard in the first place. It wasn't just about the ceremony and tradition. It was about protecting someone who truly cared about her people, who had dedicated her entire life to serving others. As the afternoon wore on, James noticed that people were beginning to leave. Personal items among the flowers that told stories of their own connections to the Queen. A woman left a photograph of herself meeting the Queen during a charity event. A man placed his grandfather's war medals at the fence, explaining to his son that his grandfather had fought for the Queen during World War. The most touching moment came when a group of children from a local hospital arrived in wheelchairs and with their medical equipment. They had been brought by nurses and volunteers who wanted to give them a chance to say goodbye to the Queen. Each child had made a drawing or written a letter, and they took turns placing their artwork among the flowers. One little boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old and was clearly very ill had drawn a picture of the Queen, wearing her crown and holding hands with what appeared to be an angel. At the bottom, in shaky child's handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being our Queen. Say hello to my daddy in heaven." James felt his composure crack for just a moment. A single tear rolled down his cheek before he could stop it, and he prayed that no one in the crowd had noticed. But maintaining his professional demeanor was becoming increasingly difficult as the emotional weight of the past few days continued to build. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the massive crowd. Candles started appearing throughout the gathering, creating a soft, flickering glow that transformed the scene into something almost magical. People linked arms and sang hymns, traditional songs, and even "God Save the Queen" with voices full of emotion and reverence. James's shift was nearly over, but he found himself dreading leaving his post. Each day brought new displays of love and respect that reinforced his sense of pride in his service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as preparations for the Queen's funeral continued. But tonight, he stood guard over a nation in mourning, protecting not just a building, but a gathering place where millions of hearts were healing together. The morning of September 19th dawned gray and somber, fitting weather for what would be one of the most significant days in British history. James had been selected as part of the ceremonial guard for Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral, an honor that both thrilled and terrified him. As he prepared his dress uniform in the early hours before sunrise, his hands trembled slightly with the weight of responsibility he felt. Westminster Abbey was already bustling with activity when James and his fellow guards arrived for their final preparations. The ancient church, which had witnessed coronations and royal weddings for nearly 1,000 years, was now the stage for a farewell that would be watched by billions of people around the world. James took his position along the funeral route, standing at attention as the final preparations were made. The streets of London had been transformed overnight. Barriers lined the entire procession route from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch. Every vantage point was filled with people who had waited hours, some even days, for this moment. The silence was unlike anything James had ever experienced. Normally, London streets buzzed with traffic, conversation, and the general noise of urban life. But today, the only sounds were the occasional cough from the crowd, the distant clip-clop of horses being prepared for the procession, and the soft voices of officials making last-minute arrangements. At 10:44 a.m., tenor bell at Westminster Abbey began to toll, marking the arrival of the Queen's coffin. James could hear the massive doors of the abbey opening and the first strains of music. From inside, even from his position on the street, he could feel the gravity of the moment settling over everyone present. The congregation inside Westminster Abbey included kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, and representatives from every corner of the globe. But James knew that the real tribute was happening outside, where ordinary people lined the streets in unprecedented numbers. These were the Queen's people, the ones she had served faithfully for 70 years. When the Abbey doors opened at the end of the service, James felt his breath catch in his throat. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, appeared carried by 8 grenadier guards. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. This was the final time the Queen would leave a place of worship. The last time she would make a public appearance. The funeral procession began to move with precise military timing. James watched as the gun carriage bearing the Queen's coffin rolled past his position, pulled by 142 Royal Navy sailors in a tradition dating back to Queen Victoria's funeral. The slow, measured pace allowed everyone in the crowd to pay their respects as the procession passed. Walking behind the coffin was the new King Charles III, flanked by his siblings Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward. Their faces showed the strain of public grief, maintaining composure while dealing with the loss of their beloved mother in front of the entire world. Behind them walked Prince William and Prince Harry, united in their sorrow, despite the personal challenges that had separated them in recent years. The crowd's reaction was something James had never witnessed before. As the coffin passed, thousands of people simultaneously bowed their heads in respect. Some threw flowers into the street, others simply stood in silent reverence. There were no cheers or applause, just a profound collective acknowledgement of a life well lived and a duty faithfully fulfilled. James could see faces in the crowd that told stories of personal connection to the Queen. An elderly woman clutched a photograph of herself meeting the Queen decades earlier. A young father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could witness this historic moment. Veterans stood at attention with tears streaming down their faces, remembering their oath of service to the crown. The procession included representatives from every part of the Queen's realm. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Australian Federal Police, and Royal New Zealand Police marched alongside British forces, symbolizing the global nature of the Queen's service. Commonwealth leaders walked together, putting aside political differences to honor the woman who had been a constant presence throughout their nation's modern histories. As the procession moved through central London, James marveled at the organization and dignity of the enormous crowd. Police estimates suggested that over 1 million people had lined the funeral route. Yet the atmosphere remained respectful and orderly. People shared water and snacks with strangers, helped elderly visitors find better viewing spots, and maintained the solemn tone appropriate for the occasion. The international television coverage was unlike anything in history. An estimated 4 billion people worldwide were watching the funeral, making it one of the most viewed events ever broadcast. James realized that his small part in this ceremony was being witnessed by nearly half the world's population, responsibility that made him stand even straighter and more proudly at his post. When the procession reached Wellington Arch, could see preparations for the final phase of the Queen's journey. The coffin would be transferred to a hearse for the drive to Windsor Castle, where a smaller, more intimate service would be held for family and close friends. The public portion of the farewell was ending, but the impact would last forever. Crowds began to disperse slowly, reluctant to leave despite the ceremony's end. Many people remained standing in small groups, sharing their emotions about what they had just witnessed. James heard conversations in dozens of languages as international visitors processed their experience of being part of this historic moment. A group of school children from Wales approached James's position as the crowds thinned. Their teacher explained that they had traveled overnight to be part of the funeral, wanting to witness history in the making. One young boy asked James what it felt like to guard the Queen on such an important day. James couldn't respond while on duty, but he tried to convey through his eyes the honor and privilege he felt. These children would remember this day for the rest of their lives. and he was grateful to have played even a small part in their experience of this remarkable farewell. As his shift ended and James prepared to leave his post, he took one last look at the route where the Queen's funeral procession had passed just hours before. The streets were being cleaned and barriers removed, but the memory of what had happened here would remain forever. The Queen's final public journey was complete, but her legacy lived on in the millions of people who had participated in saying goodbye. James realized that he had been witness to more than just a funeral. He had seen a nation and a world united in gratitude for a life dedicated to service, duty, and love for others. The pageantry and ceremony were ending, but the real tribute to Queen Elizabeth II would continue in the everyday actions of all those whose lives she had touched. James felt honored to have been part of that tribute, standing guard one final time for the remarkable woman who had defined his service and inspired his dedication to duty. 2 weeks had passed since the Queen's funeral. Life at Buckingham Palace was slowly settling into a new rhythm under King Charles. James found himself struggling with an unexpected emotional burden that he hadn't anticipated. Despite his years of training and maintaining professional composure, the events of recent weeks had affected him more deeply than he had realized. The palace felt different now. There was still the same level of activity, the same protocols to follow, and the same dedication to duty among the guards. But something fundamental had changed. The Queen's presence had been a constant, reassuring force that everyone had taken for granted. Now, in her absence, there was an emptiness that seemed to echo through the grand corridors and stately rooms. James had been having trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces from the crowd during those extraordinary days. The elderly woman with her photograph, the sick child with his drawing, the Commonwealth citizens who had traveled so far to pay their respects. Their emotions had been so raw, so genuine, that they had penetrated the professional barrier James had spent years building around his feelings. During his shifts, James found his mind wandering to moments when he had briefly seen the Queen during his service. She had always moved with such grace and purpose, even in her final years. There had been something comforting about knowing she was there, carrying out her duties with the same dedication that inspired everyone around her. The new king was settling into his role with dignity and determination. But James could see the weight of grief and responsibility in his eyes. Charles had waited his entire life for this moment, but it had come at the cost of losing his beloved mother. The transition from Prince of Wales to King was made more difficult by having to navigate his personal loss while taking on the enormous responsibilities of the crown. One particularly difficult morning, James was standing guard at the main gate when a young girl, no more than 7 years old, approached with her grandmother. The girl was carrying a small bouquet of daisies and a hand-drawn picture of the Queen wearing her crown and smiling. "Can I give this to the Queen?" the little girl asked her grandmother innocently. The grandmother knelt down beside the child, her own eyes filling with tears. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart? The Queen has gone to heaven to be with Prince Philip, but we can leave your picture and flowers here so everyone knows how much we loved her." The little girl nodded solemnly and carefully placed her gifts among the flowers that still lined the palace fence. As she stepped back, she looked up at James with wide, curious eyes. "Are you sad too?" she asked. James felt his chest tighten. The innocent question cut straight through all his professional training and touched the raw grief he had been trying to suppress. He wanted to nod, to acknowledge the shared sadness, to tell this sweet child that, yes, he was heartbroken too. But his duty required silence and stillness. The grandmother gently took the child's hand and led her away, but not before giving James a look of understanding and gratitude. She seemed to recognize the struggle he was facing, the difficulty of maintaining professional composure while processing such intense emotions. That afternoon, James sought out the palace chaplain, Reverend Dr. Sarah Thompson, who had been offering counseling to staff members struggling with the Queen's death. He had been reluctant to ask for help, feeling that as a guard, he should be strong enough to handle his emotions privately. "It's not weakness to grieve," Dr. Thompson told him gently, as they sat in her small office overlooking the palace gardens. The queen touched everyone who served her, and it's natural to feel this loss deeply. Your emotional response is a testament to your humanity, not a failure of your professional duties. James found himself opening up about his experiences during those extraordinary weeks. He talked about watching the crowds grow day by day, about witnessing such powerful displays of love and respect, about feeling the weight of history while standing at his post. "I keep thinking about that little girl's question," James confided. "She asked if I was sad too, and I desperately wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to acknowledge that we were all feeling the same loss." Dr. Thompson nodded, thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's exactly what made those days so special, the shared experience of grief and love. You were part of something much larger than your individual duty. You were part of a nation and a world saying goodbye to someone extraordinary." Their conversation helped James understand that his struggle wasn't unique. Many of his fellow guards were experiencing similar emotions, though few had talked openly about it. The training that made them excellent at their jobs, the ability to remain detached and professional, was making it difficult to process their very human response to loss. Over the following days, James began to find ways to honor the Queen's memory while maintaining his professional duties. He started keeping a small notebook where he recorded thoughts about the people he observed during his shifts, visitors who came to pay their respects, fellow guards who shared quiet moments of reflection, palace staff who spoke fondly of their interactions with the Queen over the years. The flow of visitors to Buckingham Palace had decreased from the massive crowds during the mourning period. But people continued to come daily. They brought flowers, left letters, and stood quietly. At the fence, where the Queen's presence still seemed to linger, James began to see his role not just as protecting the palace, but as bearing witness to the ongoing expression of love and gratitude from the Queen's people. One evening, as James was ending his shift, he encountered Sergeant Williams in the guards' common room. Williams was reading a letter that had been left at the palace fence and delivered to the guards' quarters by palace staff. "This one's from a woman in Canada," Williams said, holding up the envelope. "She wrote to thank all of us for our service during the funeral. She says seeing us standing at attention with such dignity helped her feel like the Queen was being properly honored." Williams passed the letter to James, who read it carefully. The woman described watching the funeral on television with her elderly mother, who had emigrated from Britain 60 years earlier, but had never lost her love for the Queen. They had both been moved by the bearing and professionalism of the guards. Feeling proud that such dedicated people were serving the royal family. "Get letters like this every day," Williams continued. "People from all over the world writing to express their gratitude. They understand that we're grieving too, but they appreciate that we continue to do our duty with honor." James realized that his struggle to maintain composure while processing grief wasn't a weakness. It was exactly what made his service meaningful. The Queen had inspired devotion not through distance and formality, but through her genuine care for others and her unwavering commitment to duty. That night, James called his parents again. His mother answered, and he could tell she had been following the news coverage of the transition period. "How are you holding up, son?" she asked with the intuitive concern that only mothers possess. "It's been difficult, ma'am," James admitted. "Harder than I expected. But I think I'm beginning to understand something important about what we do." He told her about the little girl's question, about the letters from around the world, about the ongoing stream of visitors who continued to come to the palace. His mother listened without interruption, understanding that he needed to work through these feelings out loud. "Your father and I have been so proud watching you on television during the funeral," she said finally. "But we're even more proud, knowing that you're struggling with this loss. It means you understood what the Queen represented, not just as a monarch, but as a person." After ending the call, James sat by his window looking out at the palace grounds. The massive crowds were gone, but the love and respect they had demonstrated continued to resonate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as King Charles settled into his reign. But the foundation of service and dedication that the Queen had built would endure. James pulled out his notebook and began writing about his conversation with his mother, about the letters from grateful citizens, about the slow process of healing that was taking place not just within the palace walls, but across the entire Commonwealth. He was beginning to see that his emotional response to the Queen's death wasn't separate from his duty. It was an essential part of what made that duty meaningful and important. The Queen's legacy lived on, not just in the grand ceremonies and official protocols, but in the daily commitment of ordinary people to serve something larger than themselves. James felt honored to be part of that legacy, carrying forward the values of duty, service, and genuine care for others that Queen Elizabeth II had embodied throughout her remarkable life. 6 months after the Queen's funeral, James stood at his familiar post at Buckingham Palace on a crisp March morning. The seasons had changed, and so had he. The raw grief that had overwhelmed him in those first weeks after the Queen's death had evolved into something deeper and more sustainable, a profound appreciation for the meaning and purpose of his service. The palace had settled into its new rhythm. Under King Charles III, the new monarch had brought his own style and priorities to the role, but the fundamental commitment to public service remained unchanged. James had come to respect the king's dedication to causes like environmental conservation and social justice, seeing how these passions drove him to work tirelessly for the betterment of his people. On this particular morning, something unexpected happened that would change James's perspective forever. A group of school children from a local primary school had arrived for an educational tour of the palace grounds. Their teacher was explaining the role of the royal guard when one little boy, about 8 years old, broke away from the group and walked directly up to James. "My mom says you knew the Queen," the boy said, looking up at James with innocent curiosity. "She says you protected her every day." James felt his heart race. His training demanded that he remain motionless and silent, but this child's simple statement carried such weight and sincerity that something inside him shifted. For months, he had struggled with the rigid requirements of his duty while processing such intense emotions about loss and service. The boy continued, "My gran died last year, and Mom says she's in heaven with the Queen now. Do you think they're friends?" The teacher hurried over, apologizing profusely for the child's behavior and trying to guide him back to the group. But James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. For the first time in his 6 years of service, he broke protocol. James looked down at the little boy and gave him the gentlest smile. Then, maintaining eye contact, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that said yes. He believed the boy's grandmother and the Queen were indeed together. And yes, they were surely friends. The child's face lit up with wonder and joy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small drawing, a picture of 2 women with crowns and wings, holding hands under a rainbow. Without a word, he placed it at the base of James's post and returned to his group, satisfied. With the silent communication they had shared, the teacher looked at James with amazement and gratitude. She had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when duty and humanity had merged seamlessly, when the rigid protocols of service had been enhanced rather than abandoned by a simple act of compassion. Word of James's gesture spread quickly through the palace community. Some of his fellow guards were concerned that he had broken protocol, while others understood the profound significance of what had happened. Sergeant Williams approached him after his shift with a mix of worry and admiration in his eyes. "Was quite something out there today," Williams said carefully. "Command wants to see you tomorrow morning." James spent that evening reflecting on his actions. He didn't regret his decision to acknowledge the child's question, but he understood that there would be consequences. The Royal Guard operated on strict discipline and adherence to protocol for good reasons. Their reliability and consistency were essential to their effectiveness. The next morning, James reported to Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer. Of the Queen's Guard, he expected a reprimand, possibly even disciplinary action. Instead, he found himself in a thoughtful conversation about the evolution of duty in the modern world. "Tell me about what happened yesterday," Colonel Harrison said, his tone neutral but not hostile. James described the encounter honestly, explaining his thought process and the emotions that had led to his decision. He talked about the months of struggle he had experienced since the Queen's death, about his growing understanding of what their service truly meant to the people they protected. Colonel Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as James spoke. When James finished, there was a long silence before the colonel responded. The Queen herself once told me that the greatest strength of the monarchy was its ability to evolve while maintaining its essential character. Colonel Harrison said finally, "She understood that true service sometimes requires adapting our methods while never compromising our principles." The colonel went on to explain that the palace had been receiving letters and messages about James's interaction with the child. Rather than complaints, they had been overwhelmingly positive. Parents, teachers, and members of the public had written to express their appreciation for what they saw as a perfect example of compassion within duty. "Your action yesterday didn't diminish your service, it elevated it," Colonel Harrison continued. "You found a way to honor both your oath to the crown and your responsibility to the people we serve." That's exactly what the Queen would have wanted. Rather than facing punishment, James was asked to help develop new guidelines for the royal guard that would allow for moments of appropriate human connection while maintaining the dignity and discipline essential to their role. It was a recognition that the world had changed, and the guard needed to evolve with it while preserving the traditions that made them special. Over the following weeks, James worked with senior officers to create protocols that would allow guards to acknowledge extraordinary circumstances with small, dignified gestures. The changes were subtle but significant. A nod to a veteran offering a salute, a gentle smile for a grieving child, a moment of eye contact with someone in obvious distress. The new guidelines were tested gradually and refined based on experience. James found that his fellow guards embraced the changes, feeling more connected to their purpose and more effective in their service. The rigid stoicism that had sometimes made them seem distant from the people they served was replaced by a compassionate professionalism that honored both their duty and their humanity. Months later, as James stood at his post on the anniversary of the Queen's death, he reflected on how much had changed. The crowds had returned to pay their respects. The atmosphere was different, more hopeful, more focused on celebrating the Queen's legacy rather than mourning her loss. A familiar figure approached the palace fence. It was the little boy who had asked about his grandmother, now accompanied by his entire family. They placed flowers at the fence and stood for a moment in respectful silence. As they prepared to leave, the boy looked up at James and waved. James smiled and offered a dignified nod, acknowledging not just the child but the connection they had shared and the lesson it had taught him. The Queen's greatest gift to her people had been her ability to combine unwavering duty with genuine compassion. Now James and his fellow guards were carrying forward that legacy. Serving with both strength and heart, the Royal Guard's unexpected reaction had indeed stunned everyone. Not because it broke with tradition, but because it showed how tradition could evolve to become more meaningful and more human. James had learned that true service wasn't about rigid adherence to rules, but about finding ways to honor both duty and compassion in everything he did. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace that evening, James felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. The Queen was gone, but her example lived on in every act of service, every moment of connection, in every decision to choose both strength and kindness. The Royal Guard would continue to evolve, but their essential mission remained unchanged: to serve with honor, dignity, and an open heart.